Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something, well, pretty fundamental to how many of us live, monogamy. We've gathered some really interesting sources looking at its history, maybe some biological roots, and its connection to economic systems like capitalism.
Right, and our goal really is to unpack all these layers, try and understand the forces that have shaped this very common relationship structure.
Exactly. So first off, what is monogamy?
At its core, we're talking about an exclusive romantic and sexual bond between two individuals. Sounds straightforward, right?
Yeah, seems simple on the surface.
But the story behind it, it's surprisingly complex.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the big question for today's deep dive. Is monogamy mostly about, our natural human wiring? Or has it been heavily shaped by other things, economics, culture, maybe capitalism specifically?
That's the core puzzle. Where do we start? Maybe with the origins.
Let's do it. Where does this idea even come from historically?
Well, a really influential perspective comes from Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx back in the 19th century, major thinkers about society and economics.
Okay, Engels and Marx. So not exactly romantics, I'm guessing? What was their take?
No, not really. Their argument was pretty radical for the time. They suggested monogamy didn't just spring from, love or natural inclination. Instead, they directly linked its rise to the development of private property.
Private property. How does that connect?
Their idea was that monogamous marriage became necessary to control inheritance, to make sure that wealth, land, whatever, stayed within the family line, passed down clearly to the legitimate heirs, usually the man's heirs.
Wow. Okay, so less about lifelong partnership and more about making sure the right kids got the farm.
That's a blunt way of putting it, but it captures their core economic argument. It was about property transmission.
That's definitely a less starry-eyed view of marriage origins.
It is. And they argued this system was then, cemented in Western Europe by powerful institutions.
That's the church and the law.
Exactly. Christianity and the legal systems that developed really formalized monogamy. They made it the standard, often the only acceptable or legal model in the West.
Right, the wedding ceremonies, the legal contracts, all locking it in. And this model didn't just stay in Europe, did it?
Not at all. Colonialism played a huge role in spreading it. As European powers expanded, they brought their norms, including monogamy, with them.
And often pushed out what was already there.
Yes, frequently suppressing or even erasing indigenous relationship structures. Structures where polygamy or other kinds of partnerships were actually quite common, even the norm.
It's easy to forget that what feels normal to us now wasn't always the case globally.
Precisely. And here's a statistic that really drives that home. Anthropologists estimate that polygyny, that's one man having multiple wives, was actually the dominant setup in something like 80 to 90% of early human societies.
80 to 90%.
Seriously. Yep. So this idea of monogamy being the timeless, universal default, it's historically pretty inaccurate. It's more of a recent, geographically specific development in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, that really flips the script. So we've got this strong historical economic argument linking monogamy to property and power structures. But what about the counter-argument? The idea that maybe there is something natural drawing us to pairs.
Right, let's pivot to that. The natural argument, often drawing from evolutionary psychology.
So shifting from economics to biology. What's the thinking there?
Well, the main point is that humans seem to have a strong capacity for pair bonding. You see it across cultures. And think about raising human children.
It takes forever, a huge investment.
Exactly. Compared to many other species, human offspring are incredibly dependent for a very long time. The argument goes that stable pair bonds, where maybe both parents invested time and resources, would have given those children a better shot at survival.
Makes sense. Two parents protecting and providing is better than one, evolutionarily speaking.
That's the logic. So forming and maintaining these bonds could have become an advantageous trait favored by natural selection.
Okay, so there's a potential evolutionary plus side to sticking together. But it doesn't always feel that easy, does it? We also hear biological arguments suggesting, well, maybe we're not perfectly designed for strict lifelong exclusivity.
That's the crucial counterpoint. Human biology isn't quite so straightforward. There are definitely aspects of our physiology and maybe our psychology that suggest attraction to novelty or to multiple potential mates.
Right.
So while pair bonding might be beneficial, strict sexual monogamy might not be this effortless, automatic state for humans. There's a biological tension there.
A tension between the benefits of the stable pair bond for kids and maybe this other impulse towards variety.
You could put it that way. Yeah,
And
it's complex. And then you bring in modern psychology.
where does that fit? What do people want today?
Psychology definitely highlights a very common, very strong desire for emotional security, for
Yeah.
stability, for deep intimacy. That feeling of having a reliable, committed partner.
Yeah, that connection, that feeling of being someone's person, that's powerful.
Hugely powerful. And monogamous relationships are often seen as the primary way to achieve that.
But, and here's the catch maybe, even with that desire, people report finding the exclusivity part challenging long term, right?
That's widely reported, yes. Maintaining sexual exclusivity over decades can be difficult for many individuals, even within loving, committed relationships. So you have this potential conflict again, the deep psychological need for closeness versus perhaps some underlying biological drives or simply the challenges of long-term familiarity.
It really sounds like we're pulled in a few different directions naturally. Okay, so let's shift gears again. We've looked at history, biology. Now let's bring capitalism back into the picture.
Yeah.
How has our modern economic system shaped the way we do monogamy, or even think about love?
Oh, capitalism's influence is huge and maybe sometimes subtle. Think about how much romance is commercialized.
You mean like Valentine's Day, diamond
So-
rings?
Exactly. But it goes way beyond that. The wedding industry, romantic movies, setting expectations, dating apps, which are massive businesses, they all package and sell versions of romance and partnership. Capitalism has really turned finding and keeping love into, well, a market.
It does feel like there's an expectation to consume things to prove your love sometimes.
Right, and the sociologist Eva Illouz has written extensively about this. She argues we increasingly approach finding a partner like consumers.
How so?
Like we're shopping for relationships. We swipe through profiles, evaluate potential partners based on checklists of qualities, income, looks, hobbies, almost like comparing products in a marketplace.
That sounds kind of bleak,
Yeah.
but I can see it, especially with online dating.
It reflects how consumer logic can seep into even our most intimate lives, and this might tie into another phenomenon, serial monogamy.
Meaning?
The pattern of having a series of exclusive relationships, one after the other. Marriage, maybe divorce, remarriage.
Which is pretty common now. How's that linked to capitalism?
Well, you could see it as reflecting a consumer mindset applied to relationships. If one product, the relationship isn't fulfilling expectations, you move on to the next. If it's a pattern of consumption and replacement, perhaps.
That's a pretty critical take. What about changes inside marriage itself? Like more women working, dual income households being the norm.
That's had a massive impact. Historically, marriage often had a very clear economic function, especially for women. Financial survival was a key component.
Right, the traditional breadwinner homemaker model.
Exactly. But with the rise of dual income households, that purely economic dependency has lessened for many. So marriage becomes less about economic necessity and maybe more about emotional fulfillment, companionship, personal growth.
The expectations shift towards emotional satisfaction.
Increasingly so, yes. The reason for staying together might lean more heavily on emotional connection than shared finances, although finances obviously still play a huge role.
But even if the reasons shift, the economic side hasn't vanished. You mentioned the wedding industry.
Absolutely. The marriage industries are enormous. Think about the money spent on weddings, rings, honeymoons, couples therapy, divorce lawyers. It's a massive economic ecosystem built around forming, maintaining, and sometimes dissolving monogamous partnerships.
So capitalism profits whether you're getting together or breaking up, essentially.
In many ways, yes. The structure itself generates significant economic activity.
Okay, so we see these deep entanglements with economics. Let's try to evaluate monogamy more broadly now. We've heard hints of criticism, this idea of it being maybe a trap. What's that about?
The trap perspective often links back to critiques of capitalism. It suggests that monogamy, especially the ideal of the isolated nuclear family, serves the system.
How? By keeping people focused inward.
Kind of. The argument is that by channeling people's energy and resources into these small private units, it makes them more dependent on wage labor, less connected to broader community support, and potentially less likely to, say, challenge the status quo collectively. It creates manageable consuming units.
So it could be seen as a structure that supports the economic system by keeping people contained.
That's the essence of that critique. But then you have the complete opposite view, the triumph perspective.
Which emphasizes the good sides.
Exactly. This view highlights the potential benefits. reduced conflict, particularly male-on-male violence, sometimes associated with competition for mates in non-monogamous settings, greater social stability, and potentially better outcomes for children raised in stable two-parent households.
Is there evidence for that stability argument?
There are studies, yes, that show correlations. Societies where monogamy is the norm tend to have lower rates of certain crimes, and sometimes greater gender equality compared to societies with widespread polygyny.
Tend to. Correlations.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's suggestive, but maybe not definitive proof of causation.
Precisely. Social systems are incredibly complex. It's hard to isolate one factor like the marriage system and say it causes lower crime rates definitively. Many other things are going on: economic factors, cultural values, legal systems.
Right, you can't just swap out the marriage system and expect everything else to stay the same.
Exactly. So we have these two big narratives: monogamy as a potentially restrictive trap serving capitalism, or monogamy as a triumph leading to stability and better outcomes.
So, wrapping this all up,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like the answer to our original question, nature or nurture, biology or capitalism, is probably both.
Yeah.
Neither.
Mm.
It's complicated.
That really seems to be the takeaway. It's highly unlikely monogamy is just a natural instinct or just a social construct designed by capitalism.
Yeah.
It seems much more like a very complex mix. It probably has, ancient roots tied to our evolutionary history, maybe around raising kids, but it's also undeniable that economic systems, cultural norms, laws, religion, they've all massively shaped, reinforced, and redefined it over centuries.
So the monogamy we practice today isn't necessarily the same as some ancient pair bond. It's been filtered through history and economics.
Absolutely. It's been adapted and utilized by different systems for different ends. And how you, the listener, perceive it, whether it feels like a fulfilling natural bond or maybe something more restrictive, that perception is probably tied up just as much with your own personal definition of love, commitment, and freedom as it is with these big historical or biological forces.
That's a really interesting final thought. What monogamy means depends on what love means to you.
In a way, yes, the meaning isn't fixed.
So maybe something for everyone listening to think about. Reflecting on all these influences, biology, history, economics, culture, how do you think they shape your own views? Your experiences with monogamy or maybe other relationship structures? Definitely food for thought.
Indeed. It touches on how we understand ourselves and our deepest connections.
Well, thanks for digging into this with me. Fascinating stuff.
My pleasure.
And thanks to you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.